at the Pretrial Justice Institute. And if anyone's having any technical issues, please feel free to use the chat box to chat us. We do have everyone muted to get started today, but we welcome your questions and comments in the chat box at any time. Just hover over your Zoom screen and you should see the button pop up down at the bottom to be able to access the chat. And I'll be turning it over to the faculty for us to begin in just a few seconds. And we have reached 12:30 Eastern time. So again, everyone is muted to get started. Please feel free to use the chat box to send any questions, comments, technical issues throughout the event. And I'll turn it over to Taryn to begin our conference for today.
Thank you so much, Megan, and thank you to our event producing partners at the Pretrial Justice Institute, Brian Taylor, Sharice Hanaberdeen, and Megan Guevara. We really are so grateful to be hosted here on your platform today. So I'm Taryn Merkel of Law Enforcement Leaders to Reduce Crime and Incarceration. We are a project of the Brennan Center for Justice. And our coalition group, Law Enforcement Leaders, unites nearly over, actually at this point, 200 former police chiefs, elected prosecutors, former and state district attorneys, a wide range of membership from across the country, including all 50 states. Our national coalition urges changes to laws and practice to more effectively fight crime while reducing unnecessary imprisonment. And this summer, as communities across the country debate policing and defunding the police and the role of the police in our future, we are delighted to welcome you to this virtual event to discuss policing and police accountability. Our first speaker is Dr. Ron Serpatz. He is the founding chairman and executive director of Law Enforcement Leaders to Reduce Crime and Incarceration. And he has also served as a member of the National Advisory Board to Cure Violence in Chicago and is an executive fellow to the National Police Foundation. Dr. Serpatz?
Well, thank you, Taryn, and thank everyone for being here today. As the executive director of Law Enforcement Leaders, I'm proud to tell you that we have been together now for more than 5 years. And we've had an opportunity through our membership to speak at the national, state, and local level about these issues that we think are so important, reducing crime and reducing incarceration at the same time. As we move into the future, I want to make sure to thank Taryn, Sun Woo, and Laylee, the LEL staff, who've just done an amazing job every day to include the things that they've done to make this webinar available for you today. We look forward to the next couple hours and hope that we can engage in this meaningful debate today and every day about how the police can best serve the communities that they serve. So thank you, Taryn. Looking forward to the rest of the day.
Thank you so much, Dr. Serpatz. It is now my honor to introduce James Johnson, as we call him Jim. Jim Johnson is the 79th Corporation Counsel for the City of New York, and he is also a founding member of Law Enforcement Leaders to Reduce Crime and Incarceration. As the chief lawyer for New York City, Mr. Johnson leads the New York City Law Department, overseeing approximately 1,000 attorneys and 890 support professionals. Mr. Johnson previously served as Undersecretary of the Treasury for Enforcement under the Clinton administration, where he saw the operations of the ATF, the Secret Service, the Customs Service, and other enforcement and regulatory bureaus. Mr. Johnson also served as special counsel to New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy for the Atlantic City transition and as a senior fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice. He's also a former chairman of the Brennan Center for Justice. As I mentioned, Jim Johnson is a founding member of Law Enforcement Leaders to Reduce Crime and Incarceration and cares deeply about the topics of our panel here today, and he will be kicking us off with some welcoming remarks. Jim?
Great. Thanks, Taryn, and good afternoon to you all. Taryn, not only thank you for you and the rest of your team bringing us together, but the energy and the insight that you've brought to law enforcement leaders and to the Brennan Center in what feels like now a long time, but it's just a short time ago. You've done a tremendous amount. We've seen a lot, and we're really grateful for that. I think it's critical, as all of us do, that we come together now in this period of racial reckoning, particularly with policing at the center of the discussion. I've been engaged on issues of policing and fairness personally since I was first able to go to the store by myself at 6, and my parents cautioned me never to leave without a receipt. Professionally, it started after my second summer of law school and continued through my time as an assistant U.S. attorney, a senior official at Clinton's Treasury Department, and at the Brennan Center for Justice, as well as chair of New Jersey's Advisory Committee on Police Standards. It's 5 decades of time that I've been engaged on these issues, actually a little bit more than that. And there have been various points where people have pointed to say, okay, this is the moment of change. This moment feels different. How different it actually is really depends on us. To set a frame, I thought I'd share with you snippets, portions of 3 different reports on policing and on race. From the first, which is a commission that was working in Chicago, they found that they were convened after there had been civil unrest and violence in the streets. What they found was that part of the causes were discrimination in housing and employment and persecution at the hands of local police and the criminal justice system. In their report, they offered these words: from the testimony of court officials before the commission and its investigation, it indicates that African Americans are more commonly arrested, subjected to police identification, and convicted than white offenders. That on similar evidence, they are generally held and convicted on more serious charges, and that they are given longer sentences. These practices and tendencies are not only unfair to African Americans, but weaken the machinery of justice. And when taken with greater inability of African Americans to pay fines, in addition to or in lieu of terms in jail, they produce misleading statistics of African American crime. The historian Jill Lepore, who studied many of these reports, said that this report led to almost no change. Decades later, there was a commission convened and a report about civil unrest in Harlem. And yet another hardworking commission weighed in. This time, their diagnosis was this. This sudden breach of public order was the result of a highly emotional situation, due in large part to years of nervous strain from unemployment and insecurity. There's a deep sense of wrong that was a result of discrimination in school system, discrimination by the police, and all the evils due to dreadful overcrowding, unfair rentals, and inadequate institutional care. What was to blame? Blame was a society that tolerates inadequate and often wretched housing, inadequate and inefficient schools and other public facilities, unemployment, high rents, and brutality and lack of courtesy from the police. Moving a few decades further is another commission-issued report. And as part of this, this was after 67 and 68 when there was civil unrest in Newark, New Jersey, and then in more than 140 cities across the country in 67 and 68. And when the commission went into the street to interview, the complaints were about 3 things: police brutality, unemployment, and lack of relocation or opportunity for displaced workers. In the final words of the report, they said that no institution received more scrutiny or complaint than the police. The first report I read from, the summary, was for Chicago Commission on Race Relations in 1922. The second was issued by our committee reporting on civil unrest in Harlem in 1935. The third was from the Kerner Commission report in 1968. Many of the issues were the same. The only difference was, and I changed it to bring it up to date, was in the first report, they talked about colored people and Negroes. In the second report, they talked about colored people. The third, Kerner, discussed Blacks and Negroes. Other than that, a lot of the issues were the same. I raise that history because it's a backdrop for this work and a caution. It should compel us to do something a little bit different from what some may view as incremental change. Doing something different is part of the law enforcement leaders' founding DNA. We were lucky to have as chair Ron at one of our very first meetings when we pulled together 40 law enforcement senior officials or retired officials from across the country. I remember when we went around the room and people talked about the need for change. And finally, we got to one sheriff, and he said, and he was a very senior person who had been at this for a very long time, and he put it bluntly, "What we're doing is nuts." And that kicked off the discussions that led to the pillars of the law enforcement leaders. And I'm looking forward to this discussion today as we dive into issues of accountability and community engagement, community policing. But I'm looking to something more than that. I'm looking to a report that we can release in 2025 that will look back on 2020 as a moment of particular clarity. I look at it as a time when we're going to look at conversations like this one and say that it led to action and even further change. I hope that the first line of that report in 225 reads something like this: that by 2025, law enforcement will no longer be viewed as an entity that's apart from the communities that we serve, rather that we are part of those communities and that we're engaged in a joint project to serve the common good. We will all be better for it. And thank you so much for participating today.
Thank you so much, Jim. It is now my pleasure to kick off the first panel, and I'd like to first introduce you to our moderator. Chief Hassan Aden is the former Chief of Police of the Greenville Police Department in Greenville, North Carolina. Hassan has served as the Chief Operations Officer at the Police Assessment Resource Center, where he oversaw the consent decree monitoring team in Seattle. He currently serves as the monitor on the Cleveland monitoring team and managing technical assistance initiatives, and as a deputy monitor for the Baltimore consent decree. Like many of our law enforcement leaders members, he brings a wealth of lived experience to our work, in addition to his decades of service in law enforcement. Chief Aden.
Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. I'm going to jump right into this. We have a lot to cover in a little bit of time, but there's never been a more important time to discuss what we're going to discuss today about policing in America and the state of policing in America. Police killings and excessive use of force make communities less safe. There's no disputing that. And although no single police incident represents an entire police department, nothing undermines years of work developing community trust as quickly as incidents where police use unnecessary or excessive force. We've seen this over and over and over in communities that didn't previously have problems. And then one incident literally wipes out years of work. With everything that we've seen in the last few months, and quite frankly, in our history, our profession's at a turning point. The recent spate of incidents involving the police, particularly in use of deadly force and excessive force, underscores the urgent need for law enforcement reform to ensure that police practices promote respect for the dignity, the rights, and the life of every person with whom the police come into contact. We must also acknowledge and confront the racial disparities we see across our systems of justice. We need transformational change, and we need them in training, in police culture, in how we track police misconduct and ensure decertified officers are not reemployed. We need to also just sort of realign what communities expect from police and how to ensure that the police deliver on those expectations. And particularly, an area of particular interest that's been discussed, over and over, and it's filled with complexities and sort of, prickly edges around it. It's the police accountability. We need change in disciplinary procedures and processes that actually bring change. We need changes to union contracts that at times allow police departments to resist change and undermine efforts to hold police accountable. We need to normalize police accountability with robust internal procedures and, in cases of egregious misconduct, such as the police action that killed George Floyd, thorough and fair investigations and prosecution. Now, as you look at this panel from the outset, you may be wondering why we should be listening to law enforcement. So we have police and sheriffs and prosecutors all represented. Aren't these the very people who set up the systems that need to be reformed that we're talking about? Well, I think once you hear about who we have on our panel today, you'll realize that our speakers have been at the forefront of innovative reforms and cutting edge thinking about policing for decades. It's a complex profession, and the expectations that communities have of police have changed and grown as communities have changed and grown. And as the police have been tasked with handling the consequences of many of our social ills, such as mental health issues and drug addiction, many of those things weren't contemplated years ago. Today, becoming a police officer means a lot more than simply law and order. Our panel today, again, is filled with people who've been thinking very deeply about policing and its role in diverse communities. These issues are difficult, and we hope that their perspectives will help us all think through our many challenges in all of our communities. Let's start with training. This is a big, chunky area. And for this area, I'd like to turn to Sue Rahr. Ms. Rahr is a National Police Foundation Executive Fellow and the former King County Sheriff in Washington State. After serving as sheriff for 7 years, Sue was appointed to serve as the Executive Director of the Washington State Criminal Justice Training Commission, where she implements all of the curriculum, including it wired throughout the curriculum, the philosophy of guardian policing. In 2014, she was appointed to President Obama's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. So Sue, many have recently asked a question: how much more training do police need? Can more training actually help?
I think absolutely more training will help. The challenge is finding the right balance between what the community and what local government is willing to pay for. Good training isn't cheap. So we are constantly trying to expand the amount of training we do, but we have to do it within realistic parameters. Do you want me to go ahead and just launch into my points?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I'm still learning this new Zoom platform and communicating with people virtually. So bear with me.
We all are.
So first of all, I want to cover, I'd like to introduce, I should say, several topics that I think are ripe for discussion. And I'm just going to scratch the surface of each. And then maybe we can come back and revisit if people want to do a deeper dive. So training and hiring officers starts with recruiting. And this has been a challenge, particularly when we try to create a more diverse workforce. And we really have to think about two things. How are we recruiting and what tools are we using to recruit? I have been asked many times about some of the ads that come out. And I would just say this: if you're going to do an advertising campaign, think about the message. Are you advertising all about the adventure, or are you advertising about the service? And that is going to attract, depending on your message, that each are going to attract a slightly different group of people. I would encourage people to really focus on the service aspect of policing. We also have to reconsider what our sources of outreach are. And we need to find sources that are legitimate in a more diverse group of people. If we're only recruiting at military bases, that's a good place to start, but there's many other opportunities. One really interesting one that we're working on now is reaching out to union members who have kids that are in their 20s. And union members will focus on the importance of having a good high wage paying job that is a long-term career. So we're going to be reaching out to parents in the trades that might have a broader, more diverse group of kids. Social media, you have to be on social media, period. If you want to attract the next generation of officers, they get all their information off their phone and off of social media. School resource officers, that's a program that's really being battered about right now. But frankly, we've gotten some of our best recruitment done in the high schools by school resource officers becoming known to the students as humans. And the students see that this is not just an empty uniform robot, that this is a human being. Screening is another critical place that you need to focus on. I would just say two things. If you're going to invest in having an officer that is going to be, that's not going to be an embarrassment to your agency, invest heavily here. Really do a good background investigation. I've been doing this for over 4 decades, and every time we've had an officer really go off the rails, there were always red flags in that background investigation. So don't scrimp on that. Really put a lot of effort into that. Retention is another challenge for all of us, especially right now when many officers are feeling like they're under attack all the time. The most important thing for retention is to create a procedurally just culture in your agency. People stay in an organization because of the way they're treated or not. I've had the great benefit of attracting some great talent to our state academy, and I've gotten people to come work here who took pretty significant pay cuts. And it was because they wanted to be part of something important. They wanted to be part of innovative change. And don't think that just paying a higher salary is going to keep your people on board, because that's really not the case. Now, jumping into training itself, one of the biggest changes we've made at our academy in Washington is to shift the philosophy of our training, and we're shifting it away from the traditional model that focused on obedience and, you know, the boot camp type model. But that model is all about getting people to be obedient to orders without question. We've shifted to a model that's going to promote critical thinking. We are trying to train people to be leaders, not followers, because we know the officer out on the street is in a leadership role the entire time that they're on duty. We also have a lot of deep discussions about the role of police in a free society. And this is where the term being in the role of a guardian becomes so important. We talk a lot about your use of power as a police officer, and your most important tool is discretion. And you have to always be considering, how are you going to make your discretionary decisions? Each recruit is given their own personal copy of the Constitution, and we talk about the importance of being a patriot. And we define being a patriot as being dedicated to upholding civil rights, rather than getting sidetracked on who's properly saluting the flag or some of those other more visual examples of being a patriot. We talk about being true to the Constitution. We still include a lot of stress in our academy. A lot of people seem to think because we use the term guardian that somehow we've gone soft and this has become sort of a, you know, hug a thug program. That's what the people who don't like our training say. But we do have a high stress academy, but we do not allow humiliation. Our trainers are encouraged to be role models of how a police officer should behave in the community. And a person with power doesn't put down, degrade, and humiliate those who have less power. So that's been an important change. We also encourage recruits to ask a lot of questions and question, why do we do it that way? Now, this has created a little bit of a problem with field training officers, because a lot of agencies that then accept our recruits after training, they're still in the old traditional world of thinking that recruits should shut up and listen and be obedient. So we're working through building a bridge from our culture to the culture that exists in some agencies. The actual training itself, we employ a lot of scenario-based training, a lot of group problem solving discussions. We have classes of 30 recruits. We train about 600 officers a year, but they're in classes of 30. They're broken down into squads, and those squads do a lot of problem solving projects. We also work very hard to integrate the different topics of our training, and our trainers are cross-trained. So we have defensive tactics and firearms instructors also come into the classroom. One of my strongest defensive tactics instructors also teaches a course on philosophy and Plato, and where we get this concept of being a guardian in the community. The mechanism we've used to integrate our training is everything is organized around 5 principles in police basic training. And recruits are taught that no matter what you're doing, whether you're stopping at Starbucks for a cup of coffee or you're responding to a crime in progress call, there are 5 things that you always have to be thinking about. And that is there a current threat? we call the situational awareness. Where have you positioned yourself? Do you have a way to quickly take cover or escape if you need to? What's your legal authority? What options do you have for taking action here? Communication, what are you conveying and how are you being perceived? Whether you're stopping in a coffee shop and having a social interaction, or you're dealing with a person in a mental health crisis. And finally, do you have your equipment with you and in proper order? Those 5 core concepts are woven through every single block of our training. And we try to make officers become aware, just like when you learn how to drive. Your subconscious is always scanning and always aware of these things. And we are building that into their awareness, no matter what kind of call they're on. Field training is our final frontier. Creating the bridge and aligning our basic training academy with field training. That is something that we have not yet done to my satisfaction, but we're working on it. And we're trying to get field training officers to align their training with the concept of training leaders rather than obedient followers. 2 things that we're introducing to our academy this year. One is called Project ABLE. That's active bystandership for law enforcement. People who are familiar with New Orleans PD know this as the EPIC program. It's been taken from New Orleans PD, adopted by the Innovative Policing Project at Georgetown Law, and it's being made available nationwide. I will send the link to that website because there's a lot there and I can't cover it right now. The core component of that training is to discuss loyalty in a different way. Discuss loyalty to your partners, not as covering for them, but as intervening and stopping them and saving them from ruining their career. So that's the core message there. The other thing that we are really grappling with is talking about race and policing. And it has been an emotional, difficult, invigorating, exciting effort that we've been undertaking. This past week, we had 2 professors from the National Museum of African American History and Culture come to our campus and deliver a 3-hour block of training about the historical roots of the criminal justice system. And it was very enlightening for many people. It was very upsetting. But the message that we're trying to convey to our recruits is, if you want to do policing that is true to the Constitution, understand the system that you are working within was built in a way that is contrary to our constitutional principles, and know the environment in which you are delivering your service. We can't dismantle the system like many of the protesters are talking about, but we can take substantial steps to improve it. And the frontline officers who operate as the gatekeepers can make a huge difference in understanding how the system works. So I will stop now because I could go on for hours, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts.
Thank you, Sue. I do want to go back to Project ABLE. I know that we could talk about this all day long, and I just want to put a finer point on the impact it could have and translate that to the George Floyd situation and what happened with Mr. George Floyd. In 2018, I had the privilege of going to New Orleans and being trained in the EPIC program. And instantly, about 10 minutes into the training, I wished that I had had that training at the beginning of my career instead of 4 years after I finished active policing. And so many things resonated with me. And it wasn't just the obvious, like they should have intervened, no question. EPIC or no ABLE or no training, they should have intervened when the situation with George Floyd happened. Everyone could see where that was going, but they didn't. But EPIC taught me that it was really, there's much more subtle situations, such as if you have an officer that consistently is oversighting a demographic of people, there's an intervention for that. There's also interventions that address people of higher rank which is particularly thorny in departments. If your sergeant is in need of an intervention, that's hard to do just naturally trying to intervene. But when you have training such as ABLE and what EPIC can deliver, it teaches you how to do that. It's one of the most important changes in policing that I can see on the horizon right now. It's one of the most important training, mindset, culture changes that we can affect onto police departments. So I am grateful that you're going to deliver ABLE at the academy, and then probably the departments will take it on early and often and in service to refreshment. But thank you so much, Sue. I'm sure we'll come back to training. Now I'd like to turn to Dr. Ron Surpass, who over the course of 13 years, his police career is much longer than that, but over the course of 13 years, he served as the police superintendent in New Orleans, Louisiana, police chief in Nashville, Tennessee, and chief of the Washington State Patrol. Dr. Surpass is one of the founding chairs of Law Enforcement Leaders to Reduce Crime and Incarceration and serves as the coalition's executive director. He's also an executive fellow to the National Police Foundation and is a full-time faculty member at Loyola University in New Orleans. So Dr. Surpass, you were a police chief in 3 jurisdictions. Does improved academy training actually result in culture change among line officers? And how can communities ensure that their police officers are working in accordance with their training once they actually join the force and are serving?
Well, thank you, Hassan. And can you hear me? Everything's okay with the audio?
Yes.
Great. So, the idea of culture change in policing is a complex issue. And those of us who have been chiefs, many of us on the panel have been chiefs or sheriff, know that it's a thing you have to deal with every single day. So training matters, but we also know that culture can eat training alive, and that the training, no matter how good it might be, if the culture is not making changes to advance with that training, oftentimes we see a gap. We just saw again last week, researchers again pointed out that one of the most significant advancements you can make in reducing citizens' complaints and use of force complaints is hiring college-educated officers. Now that's an issue. One of the problems is we don't pay or we don't reimburse people enough in the college environment to be competitive, some say. Other large departments have actually dropped the college requirement across the country while trying to recruit. So we might have to think about how other nations deal with the training and maybe extend our training academies so that there's more time to educate people. More than 6 months may be required. But I do think if you think about EPIC and ABLE, as the police chief in Nashville and the police chief in New Orleans, we instituted what we thought were policy changes to create a safe space, to create safe spaces in the culture. And to do that, we enacted some pretty strong policies. If you are untruthful, you're terminated on the first event. If you fail to report misconduct of another officer, you're going to be terminated or treated in the same way as that officer. If you allow a false or inaccurate report to be written or provided, you're going to be terminated. Now, of course, there were a lot of people saying, y'all are too strong with this. This is crazy. The point is, we felt it important to create a safe space in the culture so that police officers could say to one another, as we waited for EPIC and these other brilliant ideas to come forward, they could say to one another, look, I'm not telling on you. I can't lose my job for lying. I can't lose my job for not reporting what I see as misconduct. So some parts of changing the culture has to do with the training and with creating safe spaces in the culture. I think EPIC and ABLE do that. I think these policies on untruthfulness do that. So you change space so that people can feel comfortable as they report and ask for assistance with misconduct around them. Another critical issue to changing the culture is, what gets measured gets done. And in the early days of CompStat, there was a lot of focus on the 7 major crimes, and that was the way it was then. That's what we focused on. It expanded over the years. It got a little more complex. But those of us in the business who have actually been police chiefs, whether you're a police chief of a community with 100 officers or 2,000 officers, or even a state chief, each community is different. And oftentimes we see the measurement of police across the whole city which is one way of thinking about it. But in the city of New Orleans, for example, a place where I grew up and left and came back, there's 73 designated different communities in the city of New Orleans, and they have 73 different demands on the police department. They have 73 different demands on sanitation and workforce development. So we got to keep looking at ways to create measurements of the police that are unique enough to the community so that the policing, community policing is actually being acted upon. People are solving problems unique to those neighborhoods. And one of the concerns here, of course, is it takes people to do that. Hassan, I've been lucky to do staffing and deployment plans for Albuquerque, Baltimore, and Puerto Rico for the consent decrees. And when you get down in the weeds and you start trying to identify free time in the day for police officers, the general research literature continues to suggest about 40% of an officer's day in a vehicle free from administrative or calls for service duty. When we hear terms like Seattle might have to suffer a 50% reduction in their budget, where is the community policing going to come from? Because Chief Best, like Chief Aiden, like Chief Stevens, like Chief Surpass, when that 911 bell rings, you got to go. Community policing is not a 911 bell. Community policing is every day, every day, every day in the community. So I hope that as people think about reimagining police, if we remove responsibilities from the police for more appropriate people, I think there's probably a lot of respect and a lot of good news there. But to just simply say we're going to make these cuts does not meet two measures. The first measure is, how do you give officers time in the day to direct them, teach them, change culture to be community policing? And then what do you tell the community? Just today, Gallup released another in its series of America's Black Voices polling. Here's the hope that came out in today's poll. Here's the challenge. The hope is, when asked, would you rather see more police in your neighborhood or the same amount of police in your neighborhood? This just came out today. It was in the field in July. 81% of Blacks want to see more police. 88% of whites want to see more police. 83% of Hispanics and 72% of Asians want to see more police in their neighborhoods. But here's the challenge. The question to the same population is, if you had an interaction with an officer, how confident are you would be treated with courtesy and respect? And here's the challenge. Only 39% of Blacks believe that they would be treated with courtesy and respect. Whites and Hispanics and Asians have much lower levels of concern about courtesy. So these kind of data points, I think, give us great hope that people do want a police service that's responsive. People do want a police service that's helping them solve problems in their communities. People do want to see more police. But we can't walk past the notion that somehow or another we've taken all neighborhoods along in that path. So that's another thing about the culture, is to put into the minds of police officers that, in fact, communities do need and want you to provide a professional, courteous service. So that's an important way of thinking about training, culture, education, recruitment, and retention. The last thing on this item is obviously going to be decertification. When we speak about decertification, many in the audience may know this, many may not. The 50 states have different strategies of certifying or licensing their police officers. And as a result of that, we don't really have a national go-to standard. So if we were to include a national decertification list, then it begs the question, well, what would be the national accepted standards of misconduct that would put an officer on that list? And I go back to the core three. If you lie in a workplace matter, you've got to be terminated. If you don't report misconduct that you've seen in front of you, you have to be on that list. If you don't correct false or inaccurate reports, that's kind of a baseline thing, and it should be considered outside of collective bargaining. It should be considered outside of civil service. It should be considered outside of personal appeal boards, because at the end of the day, finishing up this whole concept, police officers do not sell their ability to do math. Police officers do not sell their ability to be astronomers or philosophers. They sell their ability singularly and only on the tell the truth. People go to jail because police officers tell the truth. Other officers get sanctioned, disciplined, or commended because police officers tell the truth. So if we truly think about decertification across the country, what would be the minimum standard to meet that? If you weren't truthful, you're useless to the business and the profession. That's what I think we should be thinking about if we go down this path.
I totally agree. We've seen examples of, there are a couple states that are that are more than just a toe into the decertification, but it addresses statewide certification. They can go to a neighboring state and still get a job and still impact that community negatively like they impacted their last one. So I think a lot more work needs to occur here on a national scale. Thank you. Now I'd like to turn to Daryl Stevens. Chief Stevens is the former police chief for the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department, and he served in many, many jurisdictions over the course of his career. He's well known in the field and outside of the field with academics for his innovative and evidence-based policing practices, which have gained nationwide recognition. For his work, Chief Stevens was inducted into the Evidence-Based Policing Hall of Fame, received the Distinguished Achievement Award in Evidence-Based Crime Policy from George Mason University, and has just, and that's just one area of his academic recognition. He was also honored with the Major City Chiefs Association Leadership Award, among other recognitions again. So Chief Stevens, without further ado, you have a lot to talk about today. You've been in the field of policing for over 40 years and been studying and writing on police discipline for years. How can we change our system of discipline to promote culture change and better policing is the first part. And how do we police, or how do police unions impact discipline and culture change in your view?
Thanks, Hassan. It's great to join you and the other panelists, each of whom I have a great deal of respect for. My focus is going to be on the disciplinary process itself. It's a critical part of the chief's responsibility, and you can't effectively manage and run a police department unless your discipline is effective. But at the same time, it's been a source of frustration to police chiefs, to police officers, to people in the community, really to everybody involved in the process that's paid any attention to it all. And you have chiefs who are frequently undermined. Too many cases result in an arbitrator overruling a decision to terminate an officer and return him back to work with back pay. Arbitrators will frequently say, well, the officers was guilty of the misconduct, but it was just too harsh to separate them from the police agency. Even in many cases, the kind of behavior that Ron just talked about, being untruthful, lying. Officers and unions are frustrated with the process as well because they believe it is arbitrary and it fails to meet the tests of consistency and fairness. Until recently, the community has by and large not been all that focused or interested in what happens in the disciplinary process. The past 5 years, we've seen that change in some parts of our community. But even with that interest that they have now, then we've moved all the way to discipline means termination without due process, prosecution, and sometimes jail are the only acceptable outcomes. I have some observations, though, on what's wrong, what I believe is wrong with the current process. First, the process takes too long. It's not at all unusual for just a routine kind of a case to go 6 months or a year before it's completely resolved. And if you have really serious charges, maybe criminal charges involved, these cases can drag on for 2 or 3 years. Doesn't make any difference 2 years later if an officer has been serving during that entire time. It's an over-legalistic process that operates more like a criminal trial than an administrative hearing or a review. Arguments over whether evidence is admissible or not take up an inordinate amount of time, and it's very difficult to get to the story as to actually what happened, what happened with the behavior. The systems are largely focused on punishment rather than learning from mistakes and encouraging and expecting behavioral change. It's an opaque process, one that takes place behind closed doors that no one gets to see except for the officers and the people directly involved in it. And so no one knows what the outcomes. And so people believe that either the discipline is inconsistent because of the rumor mills, or they don't hear anything at all, and they believe because they don't hear anything, the officer was not sanctioned. Outcomes are often influenced by the amount of publicity that it gets. High profile incident changes the way the process operates to some extent and changes the outcome to some extent as well. And has failed, the disciplinary systems we have currently have literally failed to deal with that relatively small group of officers who are largely responsible for a good amount of the misconduct that takes place within police agencies. Another challenge and problem is that police chief discipline authority varies widely across the US. You have police chiefs in some of the largest departments in the country that can't terminate an officer's employment. It has to go to a board or a city manager or someplace else. And I'm not talking about there should be review, but a chief should have the authority to separate an officer from the department. So what should a good system look like? For me, it's one where intervention, early intervention at the lowest possible level, peer or supervisor, EPIC, ABLE, are examples of how officers can help each other by intervening and changing the outcome of what could be a case of misconduct into managing a process where the officer learns from that behavior. A focus on behavior, not so much punishment. And officers need to be punished. Officers need to be held accountable. They need to be terminated from time to time. But if the system is focused exclusively on punishment, we lose the opportunity to focus on behavior, to help that behavior change, to provide the training and education that helps give officers a completely different perspective than what they might have had that contributed to the misconduct. The system needs to be transparent. Officers should have privacy. It should be respected. But the public should also be aware of how these processes work. They should receive regular reports on what happens in the disciplinary process. They should have the opportunity to get behind those closed doors and understand the complexity of the issues that are being considered when an officer is accused of misconduct. It needs to be timely. For 90% of the cases that police officers are investigated by internal affairs, there should be no reason that those cases aren't resolved within 60 to 90 day period of time. Ron Surpass, when he was in, I think both Washington and in Nashville, had a process where if officers where misconduct was alleged, the officer acknowledged that misconduct, then the investigation basically was terminated at that point. The officer took their punishment or their education or whatever the outcome was and moved on. Those cases get disposed of in a much quicker fashion, and the officer learns from it as opposed to being bitter about whatever type of discipline that they received. There needs to be community involvement in our disciplinary process. And in Charlotte, in St. Petersburg, while I was a police chief, we had a member of the community that sat in on our disciplinary hearings and had a voice in what the outcomes of them were. The community needs to understand and needs to be engaged in these processes so that they fully understand the challenge that police officers have in dealing with these complex issues on the street under less than ideal circumstances. And finally, the systems need to be fair. Need to be fair to the officer, need to be fair to the person that made the complaint, and our outcomes need to be consistent. Consistent while understanding the circumstances of the misconduct in the beginning. So if we had systems that had those 5 or 6 characteristics in them, I think you would see significant change take place in the way police officer accountability and discipline takes place. It's for most police officers, they never darken the door of the internal affairs unit. They never are involved in misconduct of any significant type. they never have to worry about these processes. But these processes are important for those few that do lose their way, or those few that simply disregard the expectations and the policies and the procedures that they've been expected to follow. And I'll stop there, Hassan. We've got a lot going on here today.
So I just have two quick reactions. One is that I completely agree with you in terms of sort of how our discipline systems have evolved, and in many ways in a negative way. And that's not to be confused with effective or ineffective. But one of the things that I've seen over the years in looking at various police departments, large, small, urban, suburban, is the difference in the quality of the training and the performance levels and basic investigative skills of internal affairs investigators. It just runs the gamut. There are some departments where you go and, if you talk to IA investigators, you're expecting to hear that they are the most ethical, that they are the best trained, and that they, have run a path of positive performance and got there. But what you might find in some departments is that's not necessarily the case. They're just filling a chair, and that person could come in with a lot of baggage. So I think really it goes down to recruitment, not just our recruits coming into the profession, but where and how you're recruiting people for critical positions within your police department, and positions filled, that are tied to accountability.
I agree with that, Hassan. There's a lot of things that we can do to create an environment, and from all the way from recruiting, training, the way police, the way we operate on the street, that really minimizes the need for a disciplinary process. Your point on internal affairs investigation, I've come into from the outside in 5 different agencies. And in all but one of those, the internal affairs investigations look like more of an investigation of the complainant than the officer's conduct. And that's a problem. I mean, that's not what they're supposed to take place. And that's an area where we can do a lot more work to make sure that those are conducted appropriately and professionally.
Thank you. And the second point was the non-investigative matters. You described them as they occurred in the Washington State Patrol under Ron Surpass. I modified it and brought it into 2 of my own departments, because what that did was essentially the scenario was if an officer backed up his or her cruiser and hit a pole, right, and that started, an investigation, administrative investigation, that officer oftentimes would just throw their hands up and say, yes, I did it. Why do I need to go through 3 months worth of IA? I did it. So they could just sign off, and there was, for first offense, essentially just a low-level discipline. It might be some driver retraining. It might be some other focused attention to what the misconduct was. But it was literally just used for very low-level offenses. But what it did was great things. It decluttered the caseloads of the IA folks so that they could actually focus on bigger investigations. So that's an area that I'm actually seeing some departments move toward, but it's been around for years. Mm-hmm. It hasn't been popular, and it may not be popular in the current environment that we're in, because to some it may appear as though you're taking some things and just sort of brushing them aside, but you're not. Yeah, you're addressing them and you're moving on.
The systems are very slow to change because people look at them, the challenges with unions and the political environment and that type of thing. It's just almost impossible they believe for them to change. Even though they can, they just don't take it on.
So Hassan, if I could just add one thing, what makes that process work is you have a pre-existing, if you're untruthful in a work-related matter, you're terminated, because the end of that agreement is, we know everything there is to know about this, right? And the officer says, yes, that's everything there is to know about this. And there's a paragraph at the end that says, and if we find out later that you misled us, then you're terminated for that, the lie. Exactly. Not so much backing into the poll. And we started it in 2001 in the Washington State Patrol as a negotiated agreement with the State Troopers Association. So there can be some room in the union. And Hassan, you bring up a good point. This actually isn't soft in a way on the police because the truthfulness statute hangs over their head. And it makes people learn from their mistakes, as Darrell said, as opposed to the union got you out of trouble again, man. You need to owe us your allegiance because we went and fought the person for this 3-day suspension that you didn't deserve. So I've been very glad that it's been helpful in a couple of departments I was in.
It has. It has. So thank you, Chief Stevens. Even with improved training and culture, there will unfortunately be situations where police use force or engage in other misconduct that requires independent investigation and possibly prosecution. I'd now like to turn to a prosecutor. We have John Choi with us. He's the Ramsey County Attorney in Minnesota. In 2011, Mr. Choi became the first Korean-American chief prosecutor to be elected in US history. Mr. Choi is deeply committed to creating a fair criminal justice system. So, Mr. Choi, as the elected prosecutor in Ramsey County, you have both investigated police and worked regularly with police. What is the role with prosecutors in helping to hold the police accountable, first? And how can local prosecutors truly hold the police accountable when you work together day in and day out and have relationships? You're muted. John, you're still muted.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Hassan, for that question. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to incorporate the answer to that question throughout my remarks here. First of all, I am just so grateful to be a part of this conversation, and I'm grateful that we're including the role of the prosecutor in relation to how we go about addressing police misconduct, especially the most serious types of misconduct or when there's deadly force involved. I think it's amongst elected prosecutors around the nation, I think it's becoming more and more important for them, recognizing that we have a really critical role in terms of what our communities want. What they want is some aspect of independence and ultimately for people to gather facts and make judgment on police misconduct or when there's officer use of deadly force. And of course that the prosecutor is kind of the last person in that line. I think also the police civilian review commissions and the police chief themselves will have a really critical role in responding to that. But I think, and especially as we reflect on what is going on right now in our nation, I think what is actually happening is something that we need to really ground ourselves in, not be uncomfortable with it, but actually recognize this is actually the fundamental premise of what policing and prosecution should be all about, which is to ensure that whatever we do with respect to the work of a prosecutor or the work of a police department, that it is very much aligned and connects with the values of our community. And I think for a long time, and I think fault can be not only be put on the system, but also our general public. We have not been very engaged on some of these issues around justice reform and policing reform until just recently, because we've had a number of events that have occurred in our nation that have caught the attention of the public, and they're not liking what they're seeing and what is transpiring across this country. And I think we as people in systems, police, prosecution, the executive branch of government have to recognize that and start thinking about how to actually make this change, because as their voices are being heard more and more and people are talking about these issues, I think the deep-seated frustration is that nothing actually ever changes. And I think that nothing can actually ever change until we actually acknowledge and reckon with some of the things that we have actually failed to do, whether it's in policing or whether it's in prosecution. You know, why is it so hard? You know, as I reflect back on my time as the elected county attorney here in Ramsey County, And we've had numerous cases that have been presented to our office in police-involved fatality. And we made a decision in 2016 to prosecute an officer in the Philando Castile, the death of Philando Castile. But why was it so hard for us to make that decision? And as I think back about, in terms of the prosecution decision making, and I think about maybe all of those officer-involved fatality decisions, why did it take so long, just as Chief Stevens talked about? Why was it that prosecutors in this state especially, and I know across the nation, we wanted to have these decisions made by grand juries and not by ourselves? Why is it that we tolerated some obvious things about investigations? If there are any police agencies in America today who might be investigating their own officers and police-involved fatality decisions, fundamentally, there's some issues there that need to be reckoned with. But why is it for such a long time that prosecutors were quiet about that or did not assert their role in ensuring the independence and the integrity of investigations? Why is it that today many police officers would look at the Graham factors and view them to be their Bill of Rights? When if you carefully read that case, I don't view it to be necessarily a Bill of Rights for officers. It's basically a standard upon which we should, how we should use force as police officers, and what is reasonable and what isn't. So those are the things that I think from a prosecution standpoint that we have to really acknowledge and reckon with. And then from there, and someone talked about this, is that we have to recognize just what isn't right. Or someone had said, I think it was James Johnson, who talked about that a sheriff said, he called it out in the room and said, what we're doing is just nuts, right? And so we need more acts of courage to be able to do those things, to say those things out loud, because if we can't do that, and we don't want to do that, then we're never actually going to have the real change that I think that the communities that we serve across America are asking for. And so as we think about that role of the prosecutor in the context of how we might view a particular case, I think one of the things that we have to embrace, and your question alluded to this because it's true, there is an inherent conflict when in the business of doing justice and fighting crime, we rely very heavily on one another. Police, when they intervene in a situation and believe a crime has been committed and then they investigate, they want to see that a prosecution occurs. The same can be said from a prosecutor's perspective. We rely on cases coming to us that are properly and thoroughly investigated so that we can prove criminal acts beyond a reasonable doubt. So that relationship that exists is something that we have to think about. And I think there are many conversations that are starting to happen about what can be done to assure that we have that independent role. I mean, right now, there really isn't necessarily one size or one solution for all of that. And the reality is that the current system continues to continue on. And so in the absence of some structural change that a legislature or a local community might come up with, like for instance, a prosecutor says that with any situation involving police in my jurisdiction, I will have or ask somebody else to do that. Or maybe a state legislature creates some configuration and structure by which that is addressed. But in the absence of that, the prosecutor needs to really take seriously that independent role and try to balance all that they can, but they have to recognize that that is exactly what the public is asking of them. And I think throughout in recent history, we have seen prosecutors who have lost elections because they were perceived having not been independent. And I think the same can be said for the police chiefs that are on this call. There's an expectation that the public, I think, is loud and clear that where we have instances of misconduct, we have to make sure that we're doing everything that we can to ensure that the independence is maintained. And somehow we have to then think about how we address conflicts. We have to think about how we have these processes in place, because our role, I think, is to ensure the integrity and the legitimacy of whatever process is utilized to get to the truth. And then ultimately, if something is wrong or laws have been violated or policies have been violated, that there's actually accountability and that we need to follow through on that. I think for too long, we have seen instances where that follow through or that accountability has not occurred. And we see oftentimes the worst of it play out. And then that's what makes people so frustrated in terms of when they see that the change is not occurring. And then I think the emerging role for a prosecutor, you'll see now many prosecutors are recognizing that, like for instance, how we maintain Brady lists is really, really critical, not just for the purpose of the disclosure piece to the defense, but also the recognition that the prosecutor actually does have information within their office about officers who are maybe not untrustworthy, may exhibit racial bias, or have maybe some excessive use of force on their record, or maybe in the context of a case that they're reviewing, they see video of it. And I think we're recognizing is that the prosecutor has an important obligation and a role, not to just kind of proceed in the litigation of that case and say, well, a judge will figure that out. But we're recognizing that we actually have a role to say that maybe we shouldn't even prosecute this case, or maybe we should dismiss this case because we're not going to reward the misconduct of a police officer. So I think this is an emerging area where you see some offices across the country doing this, but I think this is going to be more. And I think prosecutors should be working in conjunction with their police chiefs to ensure that their offices are taking measures in this regard. And there's a whole, I think, a laundry list of many other things that we're seeing as well. So for instance, I think that we're starting to deal with just the aspect of transparency a lot more. I mean, oftentimes we like to live in this world where, you know, we make decisions and you don't have this intense scrutiny involving our particular cases. But as we're finding, more and more, the public is very interested in talking about police misconduct or where officers' use of force is involved. And in those particular instances, we've had discussions now about the release of video and things of that. We have a role to protect the role of the person that is accused of a crime. And that's a serious obligation for the prosecutor to ensure a fair process and to protect the integrity of that process and to not influence in any way, in an inappropriate way, the jury decision making in that. But at the same time, there is a greater wish to have more transparency with respect to some of these things. And so I think those are things that are emerging issues. I think another thing that's really important too is that as we think about making these changes, it's so easy for us, the people that have the power. And if you think about it, you know, we've been entrusted with this power to do all of these various things and come up with their own practices and protocols. And what that has led to is in some instances, you have police investigating police, et cetera. And we need to recognize that what we should be doing is really accepting the fact that civilian control is the fundamental premise of American policing and American prosecution. And so we need to listen to those voices, but especially in this age of the racial reckoning that we're having is that we need to seek out the voices and listen to the perspectives of those who have been most impacted, whether it's by police violence or whether it's where communities have great mistrust in the police. And we need to think about sharing some of our power as we think about producing and actually implementing some of our policies. So as a police department, when we think about creating a updated use of force policy or a prosecutor's office in terms of how they might respond to a deadly force incident, I think that we should be very open to trying to invite some impacted community members to be a part of advising, to be co-designers in that. That's kind of a radical thought, because people think in policing and prosecution, well, the community knows nothing about what we do and the risks that we have every day, right? But the truth is we work for them, and actually they know so much. And if we start listening to some of those impacted voices, and we did that through, I had the opportunity to participate in the Institute for Innovation and Prosecution, where we had developed a toolkit, not only for prosecutors, but for communities and for police interests as well, about how we should better respond to officer-involved fatalities. But the most important part of that process is that we convened some of the most high-profile families who had lost loved ones due to police violence. And it was a very uncomfortable day to listen to some of their perspectives, but I gained so much, which is to recognize that we can do better, and that we have to start looking at families as victims, despite, even if we don't even know the facts of a case, that we should start having services, and it's okay for the prosecutor to listen to the perspective of a family that has been impacted. So those are things that I think are just really, really important as we think about our way forward and actually making meaningful change. I'll just end with just one thought that I have, that it breaks me as a human being. But as I think about some of my friends who are African American, who have kids who are growing up, they often tell me about the talk that they have to give to their teenagers as they are going out in the world and driving and things like that. But I think for too long we have asked that behavior change. I mean, we shouldn't have to have those conversations. We should be changing. And so that's the thing that I think that we really have to embrace about the change. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Just two quick reactions. In terms of policies and policy development, one of the trends that I'm seeing now across a variety of police departments is there are actually Brady policies being drafted and trained on within police departments of various sizes. And it really is shocking that before it was just left to it occurring somehow, and not down to sort of these mandates about, if this occurs, this person's notified, and this process then is enacted, and whatever the outcome is the outcome. But that was not occurring a few years back. It is now occurring in a formal way, and it's a welcome change, I believe, by both the police department and many prosecutors' offices. The second was the policy development piece. I had the privilege of participating in such a process to redesign the use of force policy in the Asheville, North Carolina Police Department. I facilitated a meeting with police professionals, citizens, BLM participated, the NAACP, and what it involved was, initially, it was use of force training, simulators for everyone that was going to participate, to give people a perspective that they might not otherwise have had in terms of the time that it takes to make decisions, those kinds of things. And then we went through, I believe it was 4 or 5 days of actually developing in a facilitated environment, developing the use of force policy. And that policy rolled out with 100% acceptance by the community and by advocacy groups and by the officers. So I'd love to report how it's going now, and it's been a few years, but it was the first of its kind that I had participated in. And I just think that is a very smart way to approach lots of topics, use of force, but specifically de-escalation. What are you going to do? How are you going to document it? Is there accountability to de-escalation, or are they just words on a page? So thank you for that. Appreciate it. Now I'd like to turn to Carmen Best, Seattle's Chief of Police. Chief Best has served in Seattle for over 20 years. She sits on the International Association of Chiefs of Police Board of Directors and chairs the organization's Human and Civil Rights Committee. Chief Best is currently navigating the defund the police movement in her own jurisdiction. And the Seattle City Council is at this point debating on how and when and how deeply to defund the police department. Given these ongoing events, I think Chief Best is uniquely situated to discuss reimagining policing and how we can hold the police accountable, especially considering that her department must also comply with a Department of Justice consent decree that has been in place since 2012. So I'll turn it over to Chief Best. Welcome.
Well, thank you. Good morning. And let me just start out by saying how greatly honored I am to be on this really esteemed panel with both you, Hassan, and the other very distinguished panel members, including, Ron Serpas and certainly Daryl Stevens, who I consider both a mentor and a friend. So this is really a great honor for me. I don't have prepared remarks because I just want to sort of tell the story as I see it. As you mentioned, even today, right now, as we speak, our city council is debating on how much they're going to defund our police department with the intention initially coming in that it would be by 50%. Since most of our resources, most of our budget is related to personnel cost, the direct hit would be to the number of people, men and women that we have employed here, up to at 50% between 600 to 700 officers that would have to be laid off from our approximately 1,400 member organization. So that's where we are right here, right now, today. But let me just go back a few months, not even a year ago, and just sort of walk you through the story here. I was asked to talk about accountability and the challenges during defunding and a couple of other issues, but I think this is so critically important because if we don't address it, it's coming to a neighborhood near you. So about 9 or 10 months ago, in December of 2019, the City Council authorized and gave us $1.6 million to work on recruiting and hiring practices and to really upstaff our organization. That wasn't even a year ago. And our team did a lot of work to make sure that we were hiring and recruiting some of the best and the brightest. We don't have a mandate for a college degree, but 11 of the last 12 people I swore in did have a college degree, and 4 of them had advanced degrees in microbiology, economics, some really interesting career fields. Additionally, 4 of them were EMTs, and about half of them spoke at least one other language. So we really went on an effort to make sure that we got the best and the brightest. 40% of them were ethnic minorities and women, which we thought was incredibly important as well. So we went on this recruiting campaign. I think we did a great job of bringing that level of diversity to our organization. And we have been working on that for some time. So then fast forward just a couple of months later, and we worked through COVID-19. And then a couple of months after that, the murder of George Floyd and all of the subsequent demonstrations and issues that brought forward for many people, not only nationally, but internationally, watching this man die, basically get killed by people who were in law enforcement, police officers. It was highly disturbing and made many people distraught. I don't think anyone can disagree with that. And the subsequent demonstrations and marches certainly were understandable, and many officers probably would have been joining had they not been, on the other side of the line. So here in Seattle specifically, we had a lot of demonstrations, 10,000 more people showing up to exercise their First Amendment free speech with their consternation about this situation. And we, of course, as an organization, one that's under consent decree, we were trying to manage these demonstrations. Where it got really difficult was there were groups of people embedded within those larger groups who really were there for harm and destruction. There's no other way to describe it. And I was there, I literally was standing 15 feet away as they were throwing rocks and bottles, projectiles, green lasers pointed in the officers' eyes, and a whole host of other things. And we relied upon our crowd management and less lethal munitions, which had been vetted by the federal court, the federal monitor, the Department of Justice, before implementing those crowd control policies, and used the CS or tear gas to disperse these very large crowds. Because at that point we had illegal or unlawful assembly because of the criminal nature of some of the people that were embedded. Where this left us was with a number of folks, my own family included, my daughter, my son-in-law, my nephew, and others that were a part of the demonstrations on the other side, if you will, who were there really to exercise their First Amendment free speech. But when you disperse a huge crowd like that, what you'll find is you get everybody, and while that had been at one time an acceptable tactic, quite frankly, it no longer is. So we found ourselves in this situation where we had been, at the cusp, I think, of leading the nation in terms of our response to being under a federal consent decree. All the reforms that were being asked for, we were doing them. All the reforms, many of you have heard about the 8 can't wait that they've been suggesting. We've already done it. We already have de-escalation, crisis intervention, 5 times more training. There's no shooting at or from a moving vehicle. We have a duty to intervene that's within policy. Our use of force is down to 0.02% of any incidents at all, almost, a very nominal amount, almost non-existent in most ways. And we also have comprehensive reporting. So the things that we're being asked to do in terms of reform, Seattle's just leading the way. We've done all of that. Yet, here we find ourselves in this situation where people are actually wanting to defund the organization, defund the police department. And I myself participated in some of the Black Lives Matter marches. And I stepped aside from one of the marches and just watched, just looked at people that were going by. It was between 70 to 80,000 people that were there. So quite a few people. And I was looking at the signs, and the signs were defund the police, stop police brutality, qualified immunity. And I realized that as much as we have worked really hard to lead the way on reforms and reform efforts, there are still problems. We have to acknowledge that while I think the reforms are really important and we should continue with them because they do provide a level of security and accountability. And certainly we have one of the most robust accountability systems, I would say, in the country. We have a fully funded and staffed Office of Inspector General, a fully funded and staffed Office of Police Accountability, a fully funded and staffed Community Police Commission. I don't think anybody can say they have 3 fully funded, staffed, independent, civilian oversight entities looking at all of their use of force, complaints, and policies and procedures with unfettered access into every aspect of the department. So we have those things. Yet, of those people, at least a third of 80,000 people are still finding a tremendous problem with the police department and want to see it defunded and want to see changes. So it really was a moment of epiphany for me in terms of, while I think the consent decree process is incredibly important and valuable, and we need to continue, we also need to find real-time ways, that are current. Our consent decree process was started a decade ago, and times have evolved and changed, and we need to be keeping up with that very quickly so that we can make sure that we have the level of trust and engagement that we need so that we haven't missed something that's critically important. This one tragic incident took us back a ways. And so, and I think that it's really important that we just acknowledge that, but also figure out how we're going to move forward. And I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think it's important that we maintain all of the measures that were created with the consent decree, but we also have to acknowledge that there's still a level of distrust across our genre, across this profession, and we have to find ways to address some of that in real time. And that is when we hear the conversations about reimagining policing. What does that mean? How can we have community-led, conversations about what people want to see? And it's funny, depending on who is defining what defund means, we certainly agree that we can look at different ways of providing police service. A lot of failed systems are the reason that we're responding to so many calls that might not traditionally have been police calls. We responded to almost 17,000 crisis intervention calls in an 18-month period. A lot of our calls are related to homeless behavior, people who are addicted, people who have crisis, issues. And so maybe there is a better entity for those responses. But my concern is with the defund movement is that I haven't seen the plan. I've just seen a great deal of talk about theory that less police will provide more safety and less crime, theory that, social service workers, mental health professionals, and the like will be able to address some of these issues that police often find themselves dealing with that aren't traditional police responses. And I'm not opposed to, again, reimagining and evolving with the times. Maybe there are better mechanisms in place for that. But just lopping off a huge amount of funding without having a specific plan, in my view, and I've said this publicly many times, is completely reckless and is untenable. We have 800,000 calls for service. So if somebody is going to respond to those calls at 2 a.m. when somebody's in crisis, in the middle of the street, tearing their clothes off or what have you, who's going to pick up that call? Who's going to effectively address it and deal with it when you have less than half of your police service available to respond? So I want to make sure that we have the ability to respond to those calls and to have a real plan in place. So the reimagining piece really means, not throwing out the consent decree, because we need that level of accountability, but it also means having the ability to actively engage and look at not just what services we are providing, but how we are providing them and who is providing them, but having a clear plan moving forward. I am very aggressively and assertively, talking about these issues and mentioning my opinion. I've been in this career for almost 30 years, and I believe it's very important that we validate the work that we're doing, but we also look toward the future about how we might do things differently. And the city council here in Seattle, I can only speak to my own circumstances, has been very knee-jerk. And I think that part of that has been wanting to appease or show that they have solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. But this goes beyond just having accountability in regards to systemic racism and institutional issues, which I think we do need to acknowledge, and not only in criminal justice, but in healthcare, in education, and many other parts of our society. So the issues are complex. They're real. The data doesn't lie. We know that there's disparity, particularly, specifically, I would say, toward African Americans and all sorts of people of color. And we can acknowledge that. But to defund, I think, is actually counter to providing safe communities and safe public safety. And I've spoken quite a bit, but it's really important to me that I sort of paint the picture of where we are and continue to advocate on behalf of, community inclusion, looking toward the future, reimagining how we do the work with community-led options, but also making sure that we adhere to the tenets and the requirements that have been established under well-researched and thought out consent decree processes.
Thank you, Carmen. You and I have worked together for years. I've spent a lot of my time in Seattle, and I won't go any deeper than that, but what I will say is that the city of Seattle and the Seattle Police Department is lucky to have you in your leadership position during these times. Actually, any time, but particularly during these troubled times. So thank you.
Thank you.
I think we've got a few participant questions. So I'm going to turn that over to Taryn Merkel to see what those are.
Thank you so much, Hassan. There have been a couple of questions in the chat box. Some of the specifics of the questions have been addressed by Ron Serpis and Daryl Stevens, so thank you to the chiefs. So questions relate to sort of process for police discipline, and the questions are sort of interrelated, so I'll pose them both to the group. One of the questions was how and who can determine truthfulness in these investigations. Many different entities have input, such as police internal affairs boards, boards of inquiry, district attorneys' offices, citizens committees. And relatedly, what are the panel's view of the Civilian Review Commission, a commission that has subpoena power, investigative power, and charging power? Are chiefs and prosecutors willing to relinquish the ultimate authority to hire or fire and give that power to a civilian review board? So I think these questions go to the core of the due process protections afforded officers and whether that's appropriate. If the question is one about a workplace issue as opposed to an investigation into criminal acts. So to whomever would like to take a swing at that question.
Well, I gave an answer in addition to Daryl's. The truthfulness standard for internal administrative investigations doesn't really have anything to do with the prosecutor or any of those entities, at least in the 3 states I've served in. And untruthfulness isn't a difference of opinion of facts. Untruthfulness is a knowing statement to shield oneself from disciplinary action. And that the light was green. Well, I thought the light was red. That's not untruthfulness. Untruthfulness is, did you go through that intersection? No, I wasn't even there. When in fact, you know there were. So it's much more common sense than it might seem. It's not differences of opinion, it's difference of intent. And to Daryl's other question, he responded to on civilian review boards. I would direct everybody, if they have a chance, Dr. Robin Engel, University of Cincinnati, incredibly well known in the research field of policing. She published her statements in a public forum responding to the President's Commission on Law Enforcement. And she takes a good look, almost as a meta-analysis, of the major issues that are in the conversation about police reform today, and gives an update on what's the status of known research. And as it relates to civilian review boards, not to put words in her mouth, but my experience, and I think a little bit others might agree, they're varied, they're different, they have different constitutional creations within, and they have different way they create themselves. But we also need to be a little concerned about the Stockholm Syndrome, because I've seen some civilian review boards become more protective of the police officers than the chief. And not unlike what Daryl said a few minutes ago, well, the officer did these things, but a demotion is just too much against him and his family. You shouldn't be doing that. And that's kind of the substitution of judgment that the Louisiana State Supreme Court, the Tennessee State Supreme Court, and other courts refuse to allow to happen. If the department makes the case on the merits, many Supreme Courts in the United States now are not allowing arbiters or others to reverse the sanction because the merits had been upheld. Substitution of judgment. Not all cases though, but yeah, that's what it's trying for.
I've worked with civilian review boards in 2 different cities where I served as chief, worked very closely with them and very much support the idea of civilian oversight. Some of the models, there's a lot of questions that I didn't know about Robin's research. I'm happy to hear that she's identified, but there's over 200 review boards in the United States currently. There's certain buckets where there's similarities, but they're all very different from one place to another. What we've learned from what little we know about them is that Ron already made one point. Chiefs are in many cases much more stringent in the sanctions against officers than civilian review boards are. And in places where the review board has investigative subpoena power, charging power, we've not seen any significant enhancement in both the time that it takes to do these investigations, in fact, they're slower, nor any significant enhancement in the way officers are held accountable for misconduct and misbehavior of some kind. So as we think about how we do civilian oversight, I think we really need to kind of get down in the weeds and understand what we're actually looking for in that process. And so far, I think there's more questions about the overall benefit and effectiveness of those boards than there are answers.
I think also, just to weigh in really quickly, I think that right now, this is a really apropos conversation because a lot of cities, including the city where I live right now, are having this discussion politically and otherwise. And to march into something like this in a knee-jerk fashion can be devastating economically and functionality-wise. You have to really sort of vet what you need, why you need it, and what is the best tool. Maybe the best tool is an inspector general's office to specifically oversee police. Maybe it's some form of other civilian review, but I just urge cities, municipalities to slow down and really vet through what's out there and pick the right thing for your community.
I think if I can weigh in, that it's really important in building trust. I think people have more trust knowing that it's not the police, policing themselves. So there's a benefit in that regard to having independent civilian review. But as mentioned by one of the panelists earlier, the timing is so critically important, because if it takes 6 months to a year or even longer for an outcome, not only does the complainant find that frustrating, but also the officers themselves, who want to see it come to some sort of conclusion. But I do think there's an element of additional trust when people feel like it's independent, even though, as Ron said, sometimes the Stockholm syndrome, you have to be careful about that issue as well.
I think one thing I'd like to add to the conversation too is, when we think about like misconduct and, the need to get to the truth, and ultimately somebody's got to make a decision, and invariably in many of these situations, it's a tough call to make because you got to weigh, a lot of the various factors, whether it's, I'm not talking so much in a prosecution decision, but I'm talking more in maybe a police civilian review commission or a police chief framework. But the way that it's set up, there's a winner and a loser. But at the end of the day, everybody's sometimes losing, I think, in terms of the frameworks that we have. And maybe in some instances, it's not, there needs to be a decision made and the facts to support that. But I wonder if there are other ways in which we can get to the processing of the incident and what occurred and why a citizen might feel aggrieved about how they were treated by the police. But if we just leave it to an investigation, make a decision, somebody's probably not feeling good, and that whole process may not actually further community trust. And what needs to happen, to perhaps there are restorative practices or things that can happen in the context of how we make some of those decisions on more of the misconduct areas or things like that. But I just think that sometimes I think our processes that we've developed, and I don't think any of us really developed these, we kind of inherited them by, the grievance process, collective bargaining, all of that. But maybe we have to reimagine that process as well, about how we have more meaningful resolutions of these situations. Oftentimes I think citizens may not understand or know that something was actually done in response to it, even though there wasn't a finding that the officer actually violated a particular policy. Somebody might be feeling really upset about it, and maybe there's a way to resolve that conflict and recognize it as such, that it broke community trust, et cetera. Those are just kind of some thoughts that I had.
So thank you so much, Attorney Choi, for your comments. We have a couple other questions relating to police oversight, and again, they are sort of interrelated. One is about how to get the buy-in from the police themselves. So the question is, with respect to external and independent review, a critical component is having the cooperation of the police department. The tone needs to be set at the top. How do you achieve that? I think Chief Stevens just answered it in the chat, but if everyone here who has been in charge of a police agency, please give your thoughts on how to best work from the top, and also if there's a union issue, how to navigate that as well.
Well, to start with, we need to be fair to policing a little bit. I started in 1980, and we are a far different organization and delivery of service than we were in 1980. So policing has moved from the dragnet era of we know everything, y'all know nothing, to in our communities, to problem-oriented policing, problem-solving policing, community policing, justice and legitimacy, EPIC, ABLE. So the fact of the matter is police has been very open to a lot of changes. That doesn't mean they've all been successful, and it doesn't mean there's not many left to come, but there has been a lot of changes. Law enforcement leaders is a perfect example. For the last 5 years, we've been saying around the country, you can reduce crime and arrest at the same time. That would have been anathema in 1985. A police chief would have said that in 1985, they wouldn't have made it to the end of the council meeting. But it's all about leadership. You know, Sue was elected as a sheriff, and she had a constituency that was the electorate. Carmen's appointed as a police chief. She has a constituency that's the electorate, the council, and she has other considerations in how she gets her message out. So police chiefs, I think, do a great job of messaging every day just by being out front and forward and truthful. And if you ever see a police chief becoming kowtowed to the union, you know they're afraid of losing their job. And that's never a good place to be. So I think there's a lot of leadership out there, but we have ways to go. We have a ways to go.
So I think we are nearing the end of our time. If anybody has a final 1 minute sort of wrap up, I'd love to take this opportunity. There's a question in the chat about the ABLE link, which I will repost as soon as we start our closing remarks.
I'm going to leave that to the panelists. It's a great group, but please.
I'll go last if I can.
Just my thanks to the law enforcement leaders for putting this conversation out for everyone to hear, and it's an honor to participate. And I think as we look forward, many, many challenges we face across America in dealing with policing issues. But we also should think about what a terrific opportunity for us to really make some progress on the racial issues that we've struggled with for so many years.
I guess I'll jump in here. I'm not sure exactly how this works, but I appreciate being part of this panel. I appreciate the people that have spoken today. This organization is really important because those of us that are involved in this panel are, I think, the exception to the rule as leaders, because we're acknowledging that maybe we can do some things better. And I have found it very challenging to overcome the resistance of the status quo. I don't recall who said this first to me, but they used the term, police are the armed protectors of the status quo. And so when you stand up and speak out and say, maybe we should do some things differently, it can be a pretty lonely place. And so I think this organization is one of a couple that I've been involved in that helps inspire and support to, get out there and say, we really do have some things we can do better. We have great people on the front lines. They deserve more bold and more courageous leaders. And I think we can be instrumental in supporting our fellow leaders.
Thank you, Sue. I think that was so well said. I couldn't agree more. I just feel very grateful to be a part of this conversation. Thank you for including the prosecution perspective. But I do believe that in order to make these changes, we have to exhibit courage and we have to support one another. And it's great to be on this call with like-minded progressive leaders who are very much embracing that notion that we must connect with our communities and we must enact changes, especially for those who assume the worst of us and for those who have been most impacted by policing and our criminal justice system. So thank you.
Ron, take it away.
Carmen, you want to say something before we finish?
I was just going to wrap it up. Just as so many of you have already said, just highly honored to be with all of you. I think that it's really important. The accountability piece of policing is absolutely important. And no one dislikes bad cops more than good cops. And having a system in place that has, I'm sorry about that, that has a level of accountability and transparency for both the public and the officers is incredibly important. I'm a big supporter of civilian oversight. I think that that just lends an element of credibility to the accountability of an organization. And as I mentioned on the chat, you know, NACOL has a lot of different options for how that might be done. And quite frankly, every area is going to be a little different, but overarchingly, as long as we're looking to having an outside independent entity that can elicit trust, it's just critically important, especially as we move toward the future, where I think there's going to be a lot more attention, close attention paid to how we're moving forward on accountability and other issues.
So on behalf of law enforcement leaders, it's an honor and pleasure to be the executive director and one of the founders, and the work of Taryn and the staff and Jim and Hassan and everybody who participated with us today. Thank you very much. The greatest thing about being a chief is seeing who comes behind you and does a better job. And I think that's what Carmen's been doing. So I especially want to thank Carmen for her fascinating and amazing leadership during a very tough time.
So I just want to thank all the panelists and reiterate law enforcement leaders' deep thanks to our event producers at the Pretrial Justice Institute. I also want to remind all of our participants that you do need to log into the other link for the next session. The link is available in the chat. I'm going to hit enter now, so you should be able to link in for the second session directly. We have a great lineup, and they will be discussing some of the topics that this panel touched upon, including producing community-oriented public safety and re-envisioning prosecution. And so we have some wonderful panelists in the next session. Please join us in 15 minutes, 2:30. Thank you.
Thank you all.